Okay, we're going to explore ecology now, which is how organisms are working together. So we've discussed a lot of different organisms in this course so far, and now we're going to focus on how those organisms work together. So ecology is the scientific study of interactions between organisms and their environments. Ecologists collect qualitative data, which are observations of organisms, and quantitative data, which is measurements, population numbers, etc. So these would be the scientists that work with ecology. And ecology is a multidisciplinary science. It is closely linked to other disciplines such as biology, meteorology, chemistry, engineering, geology, physics, and mathematics. So lots of different aspects to the field of ecology. Not all of them are biology related. How do biotic and abiotic factors differ? Biotic factors refer to living organisms that inhabit an environment. For example, frogs, fungi, or bacteria. Abiotic factors refer to non-living parts of an environment. For example, air, water, temperature, and soil. So how do we explain how living things are grouped together or how they are organized? We are going to discuss a lot of groups of organisms when we're talking about ecology, and we need to make sure that we're clear on what group we're discussing. How are these organisms classified together into groups? So obviously we start with one individual or one organism being the smallest category here. And then a population is a group of organisms of one species in one place at one time. So an individual organism is part of a species, which we've discussed is a group of organisms that can interbreed. And a population is then a group of one species in one place at one time. So how many carp are living in a lake at a certain time? That's a population. A community is several interacting populations or many species together in one place. But of course, since we're discussing only populations here in a community, they're only going to be biotic factors or living things. An ecosystem, however, is all of the biotic and abiotic factors in a certain area. So you might be discussing a swamp, and you're not only discussing the community in that swamp of all of the different species that are interacting there, but you would also be discussing the temperature of the swamp and the humidity and the water level and things like that. Those would be the abiotic factors. And then many ecosystems together in a portion of the world with a specific climate is called a biome. For example, all of the ecosystems in the African savanna. So the African savanna would be a biome. There are many different ecosystems, but all with one climate. And then the biosphere is the largest category. This is simply the portion of the whole Earth where life is found. So from the bottom of the ocean to high in the atmosphere, anywhere that you find living organisms, that's going to be considered the biosphere. So it's sort of just a layer around the surface of the Earth. Here's simply a graphic of what we're looking at. We've got one individual lion here, and then a population of lions would be all one species in one place. The community would be the lions and the zebras and the grass and any other living organisms in that small area. The ecosystem then would include the sun and the water, temperature, soil in that area, the abiotic factors. And then the biome would be an area with lots of ecosystems in it with simply one climate or one generalized climate. And then the biosphere is the whole earth that can sustain life. So what are the four spheres of the earth? We often describe the environment in different spheres. There's lots of different ways to explain the environment, and there's numerous ways that things in the environment interact and overlap with each other. And so it's difficult to divide ecology into separate categories, but we're going to try here with the four spheres of the earth. So we often say that the earth is made of four interacting spheres. There's the geosphere, which is earth, rocks, and minerals. The hydrosphere, which is anything that contains water. And then a subsection of the hydrosphere would be the cryosphere. That's the frozen part of the hydrosphere. Icebergs and glaciers and things like that. The atmosphere is anything in the air. And then the biosphere would be living organisms. And these are named using Greek roots describing what they're made of. So geo meaning rock or earth, hydro meaning water, atmo meaning air, and bio meaning life. Hopefully those are easy to remember. So as I mentioned, these spheres interact with each other. And these spheres are interacting as conditions change. So here's an example. As rain falls, obviously rain is part of the hydrosphere. It begins in the atmosphere, but it falls, since it's rain, it's water, it's part of the hydrosphere. It falls on the soil in the lithosphere or geosphere. Sorry, this should be geosphere, but this graphic uses a different term, which causes the grass in the biosphere to grow. And then a cow, obviously in the biosphere as well as the grass, eats the grass and breathes out carbon dioxide, which adds to the atmosphere as it eats. So matter is constantly being cycled through all of these different spheres as conditions change and things happen, different processes occur in the environment. So in summary, ecology is the study of how organisms interact with their environments. Organisms are grouped into levels within the biosphere based on their interactions with other biotic and abiotic factors. Other portions of the earth also interact with the biosphere. So we're going to spend a second talking about climate because, as we mentioned, a biome is a group of ecosystems with a similar climate. And this is a term that you may or may not be familiar with, but the climate of a location determines what organisms can live there. So we're going to discuss what climate really means. These two locations have a very different climate. I'm sure you have a general idea of what climate means, but we're going to go a little bit more in depth here. So this obviously has a warmer climate. This would be a cooler climate. And sometimes climate and weather get mixed up. They can be used interchangeably, but they are not actually interchangeable terms. Weather is a daily fluctuation of temperature and precipitation. So this is what you look at on the news in the morning. They're telling you what the weather is for the day. But climate is the weather in a particular location over a long period of time. So we're discussing climate in terms of years. What is the weather on an annual basis? A water spout is a tornado that occurs over a body of water. So you can see this water spout here. Would this water spout be an example of climate or weather? And of course, this is going to be an example of weather because it is a fluctuating, very temporary situation. What are climatograms? So a climatogram is a graph that provides the temperature and rainfall for an area. So it's a brief graphic that gives you an overview of the climate for a particular region. Climatograms show changes in climate over time and can be used to show the effects of human activity on the climate. So here's an example of a climatogram, and you can see here that the average rainfall is going to be the blue bars, and this is by month. And so January has the most rainfall, January and December in this particular area. And then the summer months are going to have the least amount of rainfall. And then temperature is going to be this red line here, average temperature in Celsius. And that fluctuates. It's going to be high also in the winter months and then lower in the summer months. So this is just an overall, a quick graphic for you to get a good idea of what's happening in a particular region as far as weather and climate. So why does the Earth have different climates? Obviously, there are different climates. There are different amounts of rainfall. There's different temperatures at different portions of the Earth. But why exactly is that? Well, the area of the Earth near the equator receives the most solar radiation, while the poles receive the least. So this graphic obviously has the sun very close to the Earth, but you'll get an idea of what's happening here. On the poles, sunlight is reaching the poles at an angle, a very steep angle. And so it is not going to heat up. It's not as direct. It does not heat up the poles as quickly as it does the equator, where it's being focused in a smaller area. And so that more direct sunlight at the equator is going to cause this area of the Earth to become hotter. And then the low angles of sunlight on the poles spread out that sunlight over a greater area, and therefore they're not going to heat up as quickly. So the unequal heating of the Earth causes the different climates that we know exist in the Earth, and it also causes global winds. So there are 3 circulation patterns on the Earth due to rising hot air and sinking cool air. So these are the global winds. And at the equator, where where the Earth is warm, air is going to rise and it's going to move in both directions. And as that air rises and moves, it's going to eventually cool and then it'll sink back down. And the same thing is happening all along the Earth here in several bands. And ocean currents work in the same way. Warm water rises and cool water sinks. So these are going to be your major circulation patterns here. There's one here near the equator, and then there's one circulation pattern here and one near the poles. 3 major bands. So how do areas of rising and falling air lead to the creation of rainforests and deserts? Why are these climates the way that they are based on wind and the unequal heating of the Earth? Well, rainforests occur when rising air creates an area of low pressure, which produces rainfall. So you can see here would be an area where air is rising, and when air rises, it eventually cools and causes clouds and precipitation, which is going to create a lot more rainfall near the equator here. So rainforests are going to occur in areas of low pressure where the air is rising. Deserts are going to occur when descending air is cooling and bringing areas of high pressure. So when that air falls because it's cooler, it is creating an area of high pressure, and that prevents clouds from forming and therefore prevents precipitation or rainfall. So we end up with deserts in those locations of high pressure. So here we've got low pressure as air is rising, and that's creating rainfall, forming a rainforest. And in this band here, high pressure is being caused by this air sinking, and it creates a small amount of rainfall, it reduces the amount of clouds and forms a desert. So you may be on the same continent, in the same longitude, but that latitude that creates the different air circulation patterns is going to cause different ecosystems and different biomes to exist. So just as a little quiz, what would you find in this location? Think about the way that the air is moving. So air is falling here. This is high pressure, and it's going to form a desert in here. And you can, since this is the United States, you can picture where those deserts would be occurring. So in summary, although weather fluctuates daily, climate is stable over a long period of time. We're discussing climate in much more general terms. The Earth receives unequal amounts of heat from the sun, which causes areas of high and low pressure. The climate of these areas can be illustrated on a climatogram. So if a biome is found in a particular climate, let's get into a little bit more specifics about biomes themselves. A biome is an area of the planet that can be classified according to the plants and animals that live in it. So we discussed that a biome has a particular climate, and therefore it's going to have a particular set of plants and animals that are able to exist in that climate. There are 4 characteristics that define a biome: temperature, soil, amount of light, and amount of water. And there is a gradual transition of species between different biomes at the boundaries of the biomes. It's not an abrupt shift from one biome to another. They gradually fade from one into the next. What are the characteristics of the 9 world biomes? So biomes are categorized into 9 major classifications, and then we add freshwater and saltwater on top of those aquatic biomes. So let's start with our 9 world biomes. Tundra is a cold, treeless, and permanently an area where the ground is permanently frozen. They call it permafrost. The taiga is also cold, and it has hibernating animals. It is the largest biome, and it does have some coniferous trees. So the difference here between tundra and taiga is that the tundra is treeless. It doesn't have any large vegetation, and the taiga does. Temperate grasslands are large, rolling areas of terrain. They have a lot of grasses, as you might expect, few trees, not a lot of large vegetation, and they have frequent fires. And often some of the species that are in the grasslands rely on that fire. Deciduous forest is next. Deciduous forests have 4 distinct seasons, many trees, and organisms that live in them often have a certain amount of camouflage that helps them to survive from predators. The savanna is similar to a grassland. It has a few trees and little rainfall, but it has a more tropical climate. Chaparral is hot and dry, has a mild winter, and fire and drought are common. A tropical rainforest has year-round warmth. It's found near the equator, and it has both rainy and dry seasons, distinct rainy and dry seasons, with a large swing in precipitation from one to the other. Deserts, as you might imagine, can be cold, but they are regularly hot and dry, always dry. There's little vegetation, and they often have nocturnal animals, especially in the very hot deserts. Those nocturnal animals will come out at night to hunt and forage because it's too hot during the day. And then temperate rainforest has milder temperatures all year with rain frequently throughout the year. And then, as I mentioned, there are aquatic biomes as well. Two major categories of aquatic biomes are freshwater and saltwater, or marine. Saltwater and marine are terms that can be used interchangeably. Freshwater biomes can include lakes, rivers and streams, or wetlands. And saltwater or marine biomes can include estuaries and oceans. Aquatic biomes are not categorized by the amount of precipitation and temperature and soil, as you might imagine, but they are categorized separately by salinity, which is the amount of salt, temperature, and the amount of sunlight. So specifically, salinity and sunlight are going to be important for categorizing our aquatic biomes. Marine biomes comprise 97% of all of the aquatic biomes on Earth because there's a lot more oceans than there are freshwater areas. However, only in the photic zone of the ocean is sunlight able to penetrate the water. The rest of the ocean is called the aphotic zone that does not receive sunlight. So algae, known as phytoplankton, use this sunlight to produce food within marine environments, and they are the beginning of the food chain in that biome. Organisms are going to feed off of the algae, and so wherever the algae are found, wherever the sunlight occurs, that's where a lot of the organisms are going to exist. Estuaries, as we mentioned, are another type of saltwater biome. And an estuary is actually a location where fresh water, a river or a stream, meets the ocean. So this is a mix of freshwater and saltwater. Although estuaries don't cover much area, they are home to many species. So there's a large diversity of organisms and huge populations of organisms that live in estuaries, even though they are geographically pretty small area. So in summary, biomes are classified by the plants and animals that live in them. Soil, temperature, amount of light, and amount of water define terrestrial biomes. Aquatic biomes are categorized by salinity, temperature, and the amount of sunlight. One of the ways that organisms interact with the environment around them and with other organisms is in the way that they obtain energy. Autotrophs, which are otherwise known as producers, obtain energy from the sun or from chemical compounds. So they make their own energy from sunlight or from chemical compounds through photosynthesis or chemosynthesis. Heterotrophs, otherwise known as consumers, depend on autotrophs for energy. And so a good way to remember this here is simply using our prefixes. Auto means self, so these organisms are able to self-produce energy. And heterotroph, hetero means other or different, so they need to get their energy from a different food source. And there are a variety of food sources, and we categorize organisms by what they eat. Herbivores eat only plants, seeds, berries, things like that. Carnivores eat only meat, and omnivores eat both plants and meat, a variety of foods. So plants and trees are autotrophs in the terrestrial ecosystems, but as we mentioned before, algae and phytoplankton are the main autotrophs in the aquatic ecosystems. So now it's time to do a little practice. Classify these consumers, so these are heterotrophs, as herbivore, carnivore, or omnivore. Starting with a cardinal. Cardinals eat seeds as well as insects and larvae, so they would be an omnivore. Spiders catch insects, so they are eating meat. That's going to be a carnivore. Bears can eat both meat and plants, berries and seeds and things like that. So they are going to be an omnivore. Cats are carnivores. Elephants are herbivores. And turtles are omnivores. They eat both insects and vegetation. In addition to autotrophs and heterotrophs, there are a couple of other categories. Scavengers are animals that eat other animals that have already died. And this is an important role in an ecosystem because scavengers keep organisms from covering the ground while they're decomposing. So think about how littered your streets would be with roadkill if vultures weren't coming in and removing some of that constantly. Decomposers, on the other hand, break down dead and decaying matter into simpler molecules. So these aren't just eating dead and decaying matter, they are actually breaking it down and recycling it back into the ground. So your decomposers here would be fungi and bacteria, and vultures are categorized as a scavenger. So how can we illustrate these feeding relationships? Well, we use something called a food chain. Food chains show the feeding relationships of organisms, and here's an example of a food chain. So this would be an autotroph, a producer on the bottom, and then a heterotroph. In this case, it's an herbivore. And then a heterotroph, a consumer, that would be a carnivore. So both of these organisms are considered consumers, and the autotroph, the plant, is considered a producer. In a food chain, arrows show the transfer of energy. So plants have energy stored in chemical bonds in their leaves that they've produced from photosynthesis or chemosynthesis. And the heterotrophs or consumers are then going to transfer that energy into their own bodies by eating it. So the transfer of energy is continuing up this food chain represented by arrows. Food webs show many overlapping food chains, which is more accurate since organisms eat more than one type of food. So it's very rare that you find an organism that eats only one item, one type of food. So food web is much more accurate because this plant might be eaten by several different types of organisms. And then decomposers and scavengers are found at every point in the food web if an organism dies. So we just represent that by putting them at the bottom here, but if this rabbit dies, they would be involved in the decomposition. Same thing with the coyote and anything else in this food chain or food web that anytime it dies, a decomposer or scavenger could be part of that system. So in summary, autotrophs, heterotrophs, scavengers, and decomposers obtain energy in different ways. Food chains show the feeding relationships among organisms and can be overlapped into food webs. All right, let's continue with our discussion of how energy is transferred through a food chain. So the steps in a food chain are known as trophic levels. So here's a trophic level, this is another, and this is another. So we have 4 trophic levels in this food chain. Since organisms spend energy to survive, like breathing, moving, growing, etc., only a small portion of the energy they consume is available to the next trophic level. So this insect might consume this plant, but it's not going to get all of the energy from that plant because the plant has used some of that energy to produce the berries, to grow, to reproduce, and so on. So some of this is going to be lost and not transferred up to the next trophic level. The trophic levels we're going to discuss are producer, primary consumer, secondary consumer, and tertiary consumer. So according to the first law of thermodynamics, energy cannot be created or destroyed. So we're not actually, the energy here is not disappearing, but it's being used for a variety of purposes. Energy can be transferred from one organism to another in predatory relationships. So we have predatory relationships going on here. But only about 10% of the energy from one trophic level is actually being transferred to the next. The rest is being used for, like we said, growing, moving, reproducing, and so on. And a lot of it is being given off as heat, and some of it is being processed out as undigested food, specifically when we're talking about our consumers here. So if we're starting with 100% of the energy that's available from this producer level, only 10% is going to be transferred up, and then 10% of that energy is going to be transferred to the secondary consumer level, and then only 10% of that energy can be transferred to the tertiary level. Because of the reduction in energy at each level, this illustration is known as an energy pyramid. So that's one type of pyramid that we'll see as organisms interact in a predatory way. Another is called a pyramid of biomass. The biomass at each trophic level is also represented as a pyramid. Biomass is the mass of organisms simply by the amount of body tissue that they have. And greater numbers of organisms and biomass are found at lower trophic levels, and fewer organisms are able to survive at the top of the food chain. So right off the bat, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense when you're first looking at it, but we are talking about vegetation here on this producer level. So if we have one plant, that's not going to have more biomass than the owl at the top level. But all of the biomass of the vegetation in this producer level combined is going to be significantly more than what you'd find on the next level, because these organisms need to consume a lot of vegetation in order to get enough energy to survive, because they're not able to consume all of the energy from those plants because it's only 10% that's being passed on. So they're consuming a lot of this vegetation, and so the biomass is going to be higher on that level, and the same as you go up. So this owl individually might have more biomass than you'd find in these other levels, but there's going to be very few owls that are going to be supported at that top level. And so the amount of biomass in this tertiary consumer level is actually going to be the least out of the whole pyramid. So we call that the pyramid of biomass, and also it works for the pyramid of numbers. So the number of plants here is going to be much greater than the number of owls at the top. So in summary, organisms can be sorted into trophic levels of an energy pyramid. When energy is transferred, 90% of it is lost as heat. Therefore, fewer organisms exist at the higher trophic levels than at the lower ones. So how does the flow of energy differ from the flow of matter? Energy in an ecosystem moves in only one direction, and it always needs to be replenished by the sun. So that's why if the sun burns out or something happens to the sun, life on Earth will cease to exist. There will be not enough energy to survive. But matter, on the other hand, is recycled. So we did discuss decomposers in this food chain. We can see that energy is moving in one direction. Decomposers are actually going to recycle the matter from these top levels, but the energy is just given off as heat and dissipates through the atmosphere. It's not going to be recycled into the ground to produce more plants. That's the matter, the nutrients that are being recycled, not the energy itself. So matter is able to be recycled, energy is not. And one of the ways that we can see this happening is through the water cycle. So in the water cycle, water vapor in the air condenses, cools and condenses into clouds, and then is released through precipitation. It's then absorbed by plants and released through the process of transpiration through the plant leaves. It can also be passed through the ground into groundwater in a process known as infiltration, or it can run off through rivers and streams on the top and the surface of the ground. And at some point it becomes groundwater until it evaporates and goes back up into the atmosphere. So this is a little bit more of a complicated process, but it should be one that you're familiar with through condensation, precipitation, and runoff and evaporation. This is a cycle of water, which is the matter we're discussing, and then transpiration and infiltration. And groundwater systems might be a little bit new to you, but basically we're recycling the water here from the atmosphere into groundwater and then back up. And just to go through each of these individually, transpiration, as I mentioned, is water vapor leaving through plant leaves. We've discussed stomata in leaves in other units of this class. Water vapor is being released through the stomata of the plants and then being released back into the atmosphere. Condensation is water vapor turning into a liquid. Precipitation is water being released from clouds in various forms like rain and snow, sleet. And then evaporation is water changing from a liquid to a gas. So most of those terms you should be pretty familiar with by now. Infiltration is water on the ground seeping into the soil. Runoff is water that's running along the land's surface. Here you can see evidence of runoff. And then groundwater is simply saturated rock below the surface. So there's usually large caverns in the rock below the surface that hold groundwater and release it. Then we can use it for irrigation, or it can be released out into streams, oceans, lakes, and so on. A nutrient cycle is similar to the water cycle here. It shows how an element gets recycled. So we can call this a nutrient cycle or a biogeochemical cycle. And this is just a fancy word meaning that this matter is occurring in living things, it's occurring in the ground, in the land, and it's also occurring chemically. And so we're showing how that element gets recycled through the environment. Matter moves from one place, which is called a reservoir, to another while taking on different forms and molecular combinations. So unlike water that is still truly H2O through the entire cycle, even though it might be a liquid or a solid or a gas, these nutrients in a nutrient or biogeochemical cycle are being modified. The compounds are being recreated and it's combining with different elements as it goes through the cycle, through the environment. And so there will be different molecular forms, different compounds that we discuss as it goes through the nutrient cycle. So energy flows in one direction, but matter is recycled in an ecosystem. The water cycle and nutrient cycles are examples of how matter moves from one place to another. So we're going to go through a couple of element biogeochemical cycles here. And the first one we're going to look at is nitrogen. So obviously we're discussing living things here. And so our first question would be, why do living things need nitrogen? Well, as you know, nitrogen is needed for amino acids and proteins, as well as DNA and RNA. Remember, each rung on the DNA double helix is made from a nitrogenous base. So nitrogen definitely necessary in living things. So what are the reservoirs for nitrogen? In other words, where is it being stored? First of all, the atmosphere is a large reservoir for nitrogen, but gaseous nitrogen is unusable for most living things. Reservoirs for other forms of nitrogen include the soil, oceans, and within living things themselves. So why is the atmosphere, even though it's such a large reservoir, why is it not containing usable nitrogen? Well, if you remember, gaseous nitrogen is N2, and it has triple bonds that make it difficult for most organisms to absorb. So organisms would need to break these 3 bonds here in order to use the nitrogen and combine it into a different compound, which is requiring a lot of energy. And so that's not the best form of nitrogen for most organisms to use. So how is nitrogen changed into other forms from the atmosphere? Bacteria have enzymes that convert nitrogen gas into ammonia, or NH3, in the soil through a process called nitrogen fixation. So they are able to take that N2 out of the atmosphere and convert it into ammonia. This ammonia then in turn is converted into nitrite and nitrate that can be absorbed by plants. So there's a couple of different processes occurring here in this nitrogen fixation process. But the goal is to convert the unusable nitrogen from the air into usable nitrogen in the soil. Nitrogen can also be converted into useful forms by lightning and through man-made fertilizer products. And then, as we know, this is a process that involves recycling the matter. So how do we get it back out of the soil? This process is called denitrification, and that's the process in which nitrate is converted back into nitrogen and oxygen. It is the opposite process from nitrogen fixation. So nitrogen fixation, bacteria are bringing that into the soil, and then through nitrification, it's going to be released back into the atmosphere. And as that is in the soil, it can be absorbed through plants, and then consumers can consume the plants. And when they die, that nitrogen is recycled back into the ground. So there's a smaller cycle over here, but generally this is how the nitrogen is being cycled through the ground and through the air. Okay, let's discuss carbon. How does carbon get recycled? Well, carbon is used for all 4 macromolecules of living things: carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. In fact, carbon is one of the characteristic elements of living things. So sometimes you might hear a carbon-based life form in like a space show or something like that. That's because all organisms on Earth require carbon. So carbon has 2 cycles. The quick cycle, which goes from the atmosphere to plants through the process of photosynthesis, and then back to the atmosphere through respiration. Now, we do represent this respiration process with animals, but remember that in plants, photosynthesis is converting that carbon into chemical compounds in the plants, into glucose, and then the plants can also go through the respiration process, releasing the carbon back into the atmosphere. All living things need respiration of some kind. So photosynthesis here is bringing the carbon in, and respiration bringing it out, the quick cycle. The slow cycle is when carbon from the atmosphere is dissolved into the ocean in the form of carbon dioxide. It's brought into the ocean, and it can be converted into organic matter, which then decomposes into fossil fuels. And those fossil fuels are only released when they're brought up to the surface, which is often through man-made combustion. So when we bring the fossil fuels up, burn them, coal, oil, things like that, when we dig and drill for those, that's how we get the fossil fuels back into the atmosphere. Volcanoes can also release carbon dioxide into the air when they erupt. That would be the natural form of bringing those fossil fuels back up into the atmosphere. In summary, there's a large supply of nitrogen and carbon in the air. Nitrogen is fixed by bacteria into usable forms for living things, while carbon is absorbed by plants through photosynthesis. Both of these nutrients can be stored in the soil before being returned to the atmosphere. And we'll finish up here with the phosphorus cycle. Phosphorus is an essential part of DNA and RNA. Phosphorus is found in rocks, so what's unique about this cycle is it does not involve the atmosphere. Carbon and nitrogen cycles so far have both involved the atmosphere. When rocks are weathered through rain and erosion, dissolved phosphorus can enter bodies of water or soil. The phosphorus is then immediately absorbed by plants, which are then consumed by animals. When these organisms decompose, the phosphorus is returned to sediment and rock. So weathering brings it into the water and then into rock, and that rock is being uplifted then as rocks get pushed around by land masses and plate tectonics. And then the phosphorus is being absorbed into the plants and consumed by the animals. And then when they decompose, it's being brought back into the sediment and rock. So no atmosphere involved in this one. Now humans have had some effects on these, the nitrogen and phosphorus cycles as well as the carbon cycle, but humans have affected these in fairly dramatic ways. These nutrient cycles are natural ways for matter to recycle. Even if we were not here, these nutrient cycles would continue to exist. But humans have altered them pretty significantly. Humans have introduced synthetic fertilizers, which have overloaded ecosystems with too much nitrogen and phosphorus. So all typical fertilizers, plant fertilizers, have nitrogen and phosphorus in them, and as those get used, and if they're used incorrectly, if they're overused, for example, you put too much fertilizer on your lawn, not only can you burn out your grass, but also that extra fertilizer runs off into local waterways. Here's a picture of algae that's overtaking Lake Erie, growing on the fertilizer runoff from nearby farms. So all of this green is algae that is building up from runoff. The lake, an important drinking water source, is being contaminated. So fertilizer runoff is a fairly significant impact that humans have on the nitrogen and phosphorus cycles. Carbon cycle, as I mentioned, has also been affected by humans. Humans have accelerated the addition of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere through the burning of fossil fuels. And by destroying forests, carbon cannot be removed from the atmosphere as quickly. Those forests are responsible for pulling some of that carbon out of the atmosphere through photosynthesis, and the more forests that we destroy, the more carbon dioxide is going to continue to be built up in the atmosphere and not being able to be absorbed into plants. Additionally, the extra atmospheric carbon that's building up is going to dissolve in the ocean, and it can cause the ocean to become more acidic, threatening ocean life. It can cause some abnormalities in shellfish, and it can simply affect the ability to survive for some of those marine organisms as their environment becomes more and more acidic due to that carbon dioxide. So in summary, phosphorus does not cycle through the atmosphere, but enters water or soil to be absorbed by living things. Humans have altered all of these cycles, causing long-term harm to many ecosystems.